Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture for Information Studies 650, Intro to Archives Administration. So this week we will be talking about archives in general, so just an introduction to archives. This is less a complete overview of every aspect of archives and what they do. That alone will probably be one class or one entire semester's worth of classes, but more an introduction to archives as it relates to a lot of things we'll be talking about throughout this semester. So it's an introduction to archives and also an introduction to a lot of the topics we'll be discussing in this class. So here are our weekly topics for this week. What is an archive? How are archives formed? And what is the significance of archives in society? And we'll be looking at all 5 of our course objectives during this lecture. So defining core concepts and principles, looking at the different ways archival practice connect and relate to each other, evaluating the role that records creators play in the construction of social memory, talking a little bit about social responsibilities and ethical obligations of archivists, and touching on a couple of these different factors that have influenced the evolution of the archival profession as well. Okay, so we'll talk about a couple of definitions of archives that are in the Sheffield article for this week, which hopefully you enjoyed. So this one talks about how the strictest definition in archives is a selection of records that have been created organically by an individual, family, or group or organization during the normal conduct of affairs. And Sheffield also describes archives or archival records as passive products of human or administrative activity. These 2 quotes aren't actually the accurate representations of what archives are, which is something that Sheffield touches on later on in her article, and I agree with. And so towards the end of the lecture, we will revisit this definition and make a couple of changes so that it is maybe a little bit more accurate and realistic. Okay, so first we will talk about a couple or a few different types of archives, some of which I have listed here. So one of the more common types of archives is university archives. Most universities and colleges have an archive as a part. Usually it's kind of nestled under the library department. But yeah, it's a pretty common thing, and it can range from really large and very well supported archives like the Ransom Center at the University of Texas, or more modest university archives like the ones at some of the different universities and the University of Wisconsin system. So, really, it really can run the gamut as far as how large and established and supported these university archives typically are. Another pretty common type of archive, or I guess fairly common type of archive, is or are religious archives. For instance, the Archdiocese of Milwaukee here in Milwaukee has its own archive. It seems like the Catholic Church especially is interested in having archives and supporting them. And so yeah, the Archdiocese of Milwaukee has an archive for the Archdiocese's records. And so they have archivists that work there to organize those records and make them accessible. Maybe not as accessible as records you might find in a university archive, but at least some of them are accessible, in one shape or another. Another fairly common type of archive is a corporate archive. These are oftentimes repositories for historical documents or maybe historical artifacts related to a corporation. They may contain inactive records that the organization maintains for whatever reason. Maybe they're legally required to keep them, or just in case the organization needs to refer back to them in the future. Sometimes these are just kind of glorified marketing tools, and they're used to kind of establish a history for an organization that a corporation can use in advertisements or however they want to sell their product. So these types of archives are kind of more associated with having an agenda to portray a corporation in a particular light, which kind of causes some people and some archivists within the archival profession to view corporate archives with a certain amount of skepticism. Whether that's fair or not, I guess that's kind of up to you, but there is that kind of perspective out there about corporate archives. And on the really far end of corporate archives, we have community archives. So these are archives that are maintained by members of a specific community. So it might be a community associated with a religion. It might be a community associated with an interest, say in a community archive related to Dungeons and Dragons. There are a ton of different kinds of communities out there, but the key aspect of community archives is that members of that community are actively participating in how that archive is operated, and who has access to materials, and so on and so forth. A couple of kind of more broad types of archives that I don't have mentioned here are private archives. So there are some archives out there which people have to pay to access records, so they're not publicly accessible unless you're a member. I don't really know how common these are, but they do exist. And one type of archive that I actually feel is probably the most common type of archive, and that is personal archives. So oftentimes, or probably a lot of the time, these are archives that exist outside of a formal archival institution, but rather are created and maintained by individuals. In fact, I would argue that almost everyone, whether they realize it or not, has a personal archive. So, emails that you haven't deleted for whatever reason, letters from grandma that you haven't gotten rid of, photos of your friends, pretty much everyone has these types of records in one shape or form. And, again, whether it's intentional or not, these records do form an archive. And so that is a type of archiving that is extremely common, but one that typically exists outside of a formal archival structure until, for whatever reason, records that are in sort of someone's, informal home personal archive end up in a more formal archive of some sort. So having talked about the different types of archives and provided a couple of definitions of archives in general, I want to talk about how archives are organized. So the records, sort of the totality of records that an archive contains are called the archive's holdings. So every single record in archives collectively constitute the holdings of an archive. And typically 99.5% of these records are going to be further organized in individual collections. So specific records usually created by the same person or the same organization that are grouped together in collections. So collections are essentially just a subdivision of all the holdings that an archive contains. And then collections themselves consist of individual records. And we'll talk a lot more about the nature of records next week, but For now, it's just important to know that, you know, holdings are broken down into collections, and then collections can be broken down into individual records that comprise a collection. It might be 100 records that are in a collection. It might be, 5,000 or 10,000. It really just depends on the overall size of the collection. So just to kind of make you aware of what this breakdown looks like. So there's a basic process that goes on where archives receive or acquire records. So this would be sort of the holdings, and then these records are filtered down into specific collections. And then these collections are used for research by researchers for whatever purpose. That research usually results in some kind of product, and then that product is consumed by society, by the public, for whatever reason. So that's a very general overview of kind of the process of records as they come into archival repositories. And of course, there's a lot more to it. Some things I'll touch on in this lecture, and other things we will discuss further throughout this semester. But a really important thing to know about archives is that they are fragmentary. So no archive can contain every single record created in the entire world, right? And so all of the holdings that archives contain are just a fragment of, the records that are created in society. And all of the collections that archives contain are not typically all of the records created by the individual or the organization that the collection is related to. So, if an archive has, say, Tammy Baldwin's personal papers, those aren't all of the papers that those aren't all the records that Tammy Baldwin has ever created or ever interacted with. It's probably just a very small percentage of those records that she's ever created, during her personal life, during her political career, and so on and so forth. So the small percentage of those records that actually end up in an archive for people to use and look at is a pretty small fragment of our sort of overall record creating activities. And it's also important to know that what these fragments are and how they are presented to and used by the public really depends on the actions of the different types of creators that Douglas mentions in their article for this week. So what this fragment looks like depends on actions taken by the individual traditionally named as the creator. Maybe they decide for whatever reason that they want to throw some of their correspondence out. That's going to impact what this fragment the archives receive and researchers interact with. Maybe a community decides that certain records need to stay within the community and they don't want the public to be able to access them, so they decide not to donate them to an archive. That's going to influence what this fragment of records available in archives is going to look like. Maybe a person passes on and their family decides, well, this, these letters kind of paint our family in a bad light, or paint our son or daughter in a bad light. And because of that reason, we're going to get rid of them. And we don't want them to survive for people to look at and be able to research them. So again, that's going to impact what this fragment looks like. As the article discusses, there are a lot of the actions that archives take, both before and after records come into an archive, are going to shape what this fragment looks like. The Douglas article highlights appraisal and how that is a creative act, but there are a lot of ways that archives mediate to influence what this fragment is and how it's presented to researchers. And we'll talk about those different activities a little bit in this lecture and really throughout the rest of this, this course. And finally, there's also the creation by the activators that Douglas mentioned. So a researcher may work with a collection or may work with records within a collection and say, hey, you know, I've done some research and this record actually means this, or this record actually indicates this. And that can result in different collections or different records being viewed in a different way or understood in a different way. And that can influence sort of how they're viewed and how they're presented and how researchers may use them in the future. So all these things are creative acts, and they all influence the small sliver of records that researchers actually work with and use in archival custody. An interesting example of this sort of fragmentary nature of archives is in the Summers article for this week, where the article discusses finding a description of a Jewish man in the archive and talking about, you know, this is really the only representation of this individual in the entire collection, and it may be the only representation or information about this man in any archives. There may be other information about him out there somewhere, but this is the only small sliver of information about this individual that can be found in a particular archive. So, you know, the totality of this man's life is just reduced to one small fragment. And so that just kind of highlights the fragmentation of information that winds up being in archives. And so it's really important for archives to acknowledge this fragmentary nature and to realize that there is other information out there, whether that information is contained in other archives, whether that information is contained in, you know, someone's basement or someone's warehouse or someone's garage. Researchers are aware of the fragmentary nature of archival holdings as best they can, so that researchers realize, well, you know, I see what I'm getting from this collection or from these records, but I also know that I have to go and look for more information. I just shouldn't form my understanding of an event or a person or an organization based on this sliver of information that I'm seeing, and that I really need to continue my search and hopefully find other information that will help me learn more and more and more. So just kind of put this in more visual terms. So if you think of this entire mosaic as being all the records related to an individual or a organization, you know, maybe some of these were destroyed, maybe some of these exist in an informal archive or just in someone's basement or a warehouse somewhere. And archives may only be able to collect a very small piece of the puzzle or a small section of this picture. And, you know, that's what they're able to make available to the public. And that's sort of the collection related to an individual or an organization that researchers have to work with. So again, it's just important to acknowledge that there's all this other information that may be out there, and archives should really try as their best to acknowledge this fragmentary nature of archival records and collections, and just help researchers discover as much information as they can. So all this talk about fragmentation really suggest strongly that in a lot of ways archives are artificial, and that there is a lot of sort of unnatural or inorganic processes that go into the creation of archives. So uh, a lot of hands can be in the pot, and uh, as I touched on before, a lot of people involved in this creative process of um, developing what the archival fragment looks like may have different motivations, different biases, which can really shape which records uh, survive to end up in archives in the first place. And again, there are certainly archival biases that can be considered sort of unnatural or inorganic that can shape what the archival fragment looks like as well. But if you kind of look at some older archival literature, there's talk about archives being the result of this sort of natural or organic accumulation of records when in truth there's nothing natural or organic at all. It's about as natural and organic as things like Equal and Splenda and Truvia. It's something that is developed over time by people who may have a very clear motivation or influence in what the shape of archival records ultimately looks like. So you might say, okay, well, if this is kind of an artificial bias-laden process, then how can these fragments of information actually be valuable if they're just this sort of Frankenstein of impulse and influence and bias? How can they actually be useful for researchers to work with and use to try and get a larger understanding of a person or an organization's activities? There are a few different things that archives can do to make these fragments of information more valuable or more useful to researchers. So they can document a variety of perspectives. So archives can try to have holdings and collections that represent diverse perspectives or diverse viewpoints, and not just focus on one viewpoint and say, this is the type of person that existed in this society at this time, and there was no one else present that was worth documenting or really matters. If you are seeking to document a community like, say, Milwaukee, then it really is important to have the perspective not just of rich white people, but the Black community in Milwaukee, the Jewish community in Milwaukee, the Latinx population in Milwaukee, and archives really should strive to make sure that the perspectives found within archives are as complex and diverse as possible, because that just gives a more realistic community and provides a more accurate portrayal of what a community was like at a given time. And that can make the records about a community more valuable and more useful for researchers to work with. Another beneficial thing is if this fragment of records actually represents activities factually. So that, ideally this fragment hasn't been subject to bias and to an effort to influence information found in this fragment so much that, essentially the information that a researcher can derive from a fragment of records is not factual. If something is shaped in such a way that it doesn't really represent, what history actually looked like or what happened in a community or in an organization, then, those fragments have very little value to researchers. And so, ideally these fragments at least represent some representation of events and activities as they unfolded. Another thing that can make these fragments valuable is if the fragment reflects important acts. So ideally, if archives collect records about an individual or an organization, these records are focused on important things that an organization or an individual was involved with. You know, if I donate my personal papers to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee's archives, and the only thing contained in those papers is a bunch of journal entries about what TV shows I liked, that's probably not going to be as useful as records that document things like my professional career, my personal life, even my hobbies. And so ideally, the records that archives are collecting and this fragment are ones that really kind of get to the meat and potatoes of what an individual or an organization was up to. And we'll talk later on about an appraisal strategy called functional analysis that really tries to help archives determine the important activities that an individual and an organization were up to and focus on those records. Another characteristic of archival fragments that can make them more valuable is if they are easy to access and use. So if records are restricted for the next 75 years, then that really decreases the value of those records and of that collection, because it's just going to be so long before anyone can actually look at these records and use them. If records are poorly described or not described at all, and so no one has any idea what's actually in the collection, then that really undermines the value of archival records. If researchers have to go to the middle of nowhere to access records because they're not online or they're not accessible in any way but in person, then that really undermines the value of archival records, just because all of these situations result in records that are difficult to access and use, and thus, the records just aren't as valuable and as useful as they could be. Ideally, an archive is able to connect the fragments that it has to other fragments that might be existing. So if a records creator has donated papers to other archives or another archive, then it's really helpful for archivists to find some way to make these connections clear and make these connections easy for researchers to kind of navigate through. This is a good thing about online access, is you can have hyperlinks to other collections that are maybe created by the same records creator or creators. And so by doing that, you're just providing, again, a more complete picture of what an individual or organization's activities are. You're not just saying, well, we can provide you with this little slice of information, but that's it. You're saying, we can provide you with this bit of information, and we can also connect you to this other information that another repository has. And that's really something that can make really both fragments more valuable for researchers. Another thing is that these fragments are as organic as possible. So, they have been created in a way that isn't the result of a lot of, bias and influence and people wanting to shape things in a particular way. That they are accumulated as naturally as possible. Again, I just said that archives aren't natural, but there are some collections that accumulate with less sort of interference by communities or custodians or family members. And these collections are more likely to contain sort of the juicy information about a person's life or about an organization, and those tend to have more research value to archives than collections that have been kind of screened and filtered and had all the really interesting and useful stuff just kind of drained out of it because someone didn't want their family to be scandalized or whatever. So one great thing about all of these different ways that archivists can have fragments of information that are more valuable is that there's really one thing that can universally help all of these things to be true or to be a possibility. And that is for archives to work with records creators as close to the creation of records as possible, to intervene early on so that records that document a variety of perspectives within survive. So archives could go to different community members and community leaders and say, hey, we think that your records will be really valuable, and we want to make sure that you preserve them, and maybe one day you'll think about donating them. Records can work with donors to make them feel comfortable about donating records that maybe paint people in an unflattering light and say, well, we know that this may not make so-and-so look good, but we promise that we'll respect your privacy, and we'll do our best to administer these records in a responsible and ethical manner. Archivists can work with records creators to know the important acts or activities that a person or organization carried out and focus on preserving those records. The more information that archives get about records from records creators, the easier they are to arrange and describe, the less likely there are going to be a lot of restrictions placed on records because archivists can develop relationships with records creators that make this kind of thing less likely. If archives work with records creators close to the creation, then they might have a better idea of where other related records might exist. So they might say, hey, we really want to make sure that you keep these records. Can you think of other records that might be relevant to your life and your career? And archives will be able to kind of draw a better picture of what these fragments are, and then think about ways to connect to them. And then with this last one, it just goes back to relationships. Archives can work with records creators, develop a relationship with them, and hopefully that will result in archives receiving records that haven't been sort of filtered and bled and had all of the really interesting, useful information kind of drained out of it for whatever reason. So the Sheffield article touches on archival intervention, and we'll talk a lot about it in this class. Typically, in the past, archives were kind of frightened of the idea of intervening in the record creation process. That's less true today, and it's less true because it can result in just archives receiving better and more complete records and being able to provide access to them to the. And so instead of having a representation of the records that an archive collects that we saw before, whereas all the important stuff had been destroyed or whatnot, it can be a situation where archives are able to collect and focus on the records that are sort of at the center of an organization or person and the center of their activities, and are records that can really provide a meaningful picture of the history of a person, history of an organization, history of a community. It may be that some records kind of on the periphery are destroyed, but that's okay because archives aren't really interested in them in the first place. They're kind of interested in the sweet center of those records and acquiring the fragment to administer that is going to be most representative of the information that archives want to convey to researchers. So it's important to note that a lot of the processes that archives engage in are connected. And in a lot of ways, the value of a fragment depends on the actions that preceded an archives deposit into an archive and the steps that archives take after records are accessioned into archival custody. So if archives conduct really strong appraisal, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, then that can allow archives to preserve records better in the future, and that can result in a collection that survives longer, is more accessible to researchers for a longer amount of time, and is just more valuable overall. If archives have really thorough arrangement and description, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, then that can allow reference archivists to be able to access more information about a record and share that information with researchers, which makes the collection more valuable. If archives are able to preserve records better, then they can highlight their preservation efforts when they're doing things like outreach, and they can say, hey, we preserved 50,000 copies or 50,000 records last week from due to a donation that we got from so and so and so, and that can provide benefits to the archive, which can allow them to support their holdings as a whole. And we'll talk about a lot of these connections throughout the semester, but I just kind of wanted to highlight the interconnected nature of the different processes that archives engage in, and just kind of touch on them a little bit during this kind of introductory lecture for the course. One thing that archives and archivists have to consider when they are engaging in these processes that sort of shape the fragments of information that survive is to what degree archives are complicit in or involved with reinforcing social values. So oftentimes in the past, there were certain values present in society, and as archives seek to document a society or a community, they really just reflected those values. And oftentimes, documenting certain values in society or certain perspectives in society came at the cost of not collecting or not preserving competing voices or other voices that were also present in society. And so that led to fragments of information coming from particular groups of people to be viewed as more important than fragments of information coming from other people. And you might not be surprised to learn that oftentimes these people whose perspectives were viewed as not being as important had skin color that was a little darker than the people whose perspectives and histories were thought of as being more important. And so this has resulted in archives that have been fairly homogeneous and haven't contained the diversity of perspectives and experiences that they might have if they were truer reflections of society, of history, and of how the world actually was in the past. People preserve what they think is important. If you think grandma's letter is important, you and your family are going to take care of them. And they're more likely to end up in archives. If marginalized people or people in a marginalized community don't feel like their records are important because archives have never approached them to ask for them, or they've never really been encouraged to preserve these records, then they may not think to take care of them and pass them along, either to an archive or even to other members of their community or other members of their family. And again, this just results in archives being fairly homogeneous, and in certain voices and perspectives being represented in archives, and other voices and perspectives not being represented. This is something that's gotten better. I would say since the 1970s, um, archivists have become more aware of the need to include diverse perspectives in their archives. This is something the Gold article mentions, I think. And so archives are trying to kind of right the wrongs that have occurred historically, but you can't sort of go back and prevent records from being destroyed. So in some ways, it's been an uphill battle that archives are engaged in to try and correct the the damage done by archives who essentially just turned into parrots for the rich and powerful in society, and conversely did not represent those who didn't have as much power and influence. So a lot of the choices that archives have made in the past and continue to make today about questions like whose records are important enough to keep, how do we preserve records, how do we provide access to records, how do we help researchers use records, are all examples of archival gatekeeping or the archival mediation that the Gold article talks about. And if this mediation occurs in a way which deters people from different perspectives, from donating their records to archives or just preserving their records in general, then this can be pretty problematic, and it's going to undermine the value of archival holdings as a whole. If archives choose to mediate in a way that encourages broad participation by many different members and aspects of society, as the Gold article really suggests is a good thing, then that type of mediation can actually be very positive. And I think the Gold article does a good job of saying that ultimately archival mediation is helpful and it is important. It is important that archives are there to provide some kind of structure to information and to help sort of cut through the noise and help people, find the information that they're looking for and be able to use information in a meaningful way and not just kind of flail around, uh, you know, like, you see like those animals and they've been, in a zoo or whatever, and you put them in the middle of the field and they're just like, they don't know what to do with all the freedom they have. Um, you know, Without archival mediation, that's what researchers can be like. They just don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. And the mediative role that archives play can actually be quite helpful in, helping researchers know where to go and what to look for. But again, that's assuming that this mediation is done in a way that isn't harmful to society and doesn't limit the perspectives and viewpoints that people have available to them. And archives can get it wrong. We can unintentionally mediate in ways that are harmful to records, whether we realize it or not. If I'm an archivist and I am arranging and inscribing records for an ornithologist, I don't really know a whole lot about birds. I'm just kind of guessing about which of these records are important, what these records mean, and that may result in me mislabeling things, putting things in improper context, and I just don't know. But if, as Gold suggests, archives are able to broaden the people who are involved in these mediative acts, if records become more participatory, then maybe other people are able to look at these records and say, no, here's what these records actually mean, or here's where you got this wrong, and maybe provide more accurate information or more accurate context for a particular set of records. So ultimately, it's beneficial for archives to mediate in a way that allows more people to mediate in developing a picture of what these fragments of information look like. And that can be beneficial for archives and for researchers alike. And a way that archives can help people feel more confident in archival mediation and more open to archival mediation, and can get people to value archival mediation more, is by archives carrying out their activities in a way that is ethical and transparent. By saying, here are the mediative acts that we've taken. And that's something that the Gold article also touches on, just being transparent about what archives are doing and why they're doing it. What mediative steps have archives engaged in? And that can just help researchers feel more comfortable about knowing what went on sort of behind the scenes, knowing as much as possible the different influence that different records creators have had in the record over time, which again is something the Douglas article talks about, and just kind of having a better sense of where these fragments are coming from and how they were created. And archives can also develop this trust in their mediative acts by just reaching out to the public and marketing themselves and letting the public know what archives are, what they do, why they do what they do, and so on. And that's going to be another big thing that is going to help people feel more confident in the decisions that archives make, and more willing to accept that the mediative acts that archives have engaged in are ultimately beneficial. So you can see here, to kind of revisit this diagram, there are a lot of different ways that archives mediate. Archives mediate when we determine which records to accept in the archives in the first place. We mediate when we do things like arrange and describe and preserve different collections. When we provide access to collections, those are mediative acts. We mediate when we help researchers actually use collections to create these products that are going to be consumed by the public. So the archival side of things is involving a lot of mediation. And of course, as I talked about before, archives can even mediate before records end up in archives, and sort of intervene to ensure that the best records are coming into archives, and that archivists have a good understanding of what those records are before they even enter archival care. So there are just a whole lot of opportunities for archives to mediate. Again, hopefully it's done in a way which is ethical and transparent and responsible, and isn't done in a way that promotes a particular bias or a particular perspective. And ideally, all these mediative acts are beneficial ultimately. But this idea of mediation is ultimately it ultimately is a value judgment that archives make. At the end of the day, there is an archivist, or maybe a few archivists somewhere, saying we want to mediate in a particular way, or we're going to mediate in a particular way. And people have biases, whether they're conscious of them or not, and that can really shape the decisions that archives make. So as I have here, these value judgments about records are often subjective and may not be based on more than intuition or archival hubris. And because of this, archives are not and have never been neutral. We'll read a few articles in this course that talk about the neutrality of archives. Again, that was kind of the desire was for archives to be this kind of neutral party that doesn't really have any influence over what the shape of records is. And this is a perspective that really frowned down the idea of intervening before records end up in an archives. But this has never been a factual representation of archives. Archives have never been neutral. And to argue that archives are neutral or that archives could be neutral, really goes against, human nature, and it is a pretty roundly derided ambition or description of archives these days. So I just kind of want to get that out there. Archives are not neutral. And we'll talk a lot about these different value judgments that archivists make during different parts of archiving as we move through the semester. So again, ideally, the value judgments that archives make don't reinforce social values and don't result in different perspectives being crowded out of archives, but it certainly is a possibility and is something that archives should always be conscious of. Archives and archivists should always be aware of what decisions they're making and why they're making particular decisions. And it can be important. It is important that archives really think about sort of the image or the message that they're conveying, because a fragment of records might be the only records related to a particular person or a particular event or a particular organization that exists. And so if archives get it wrong and mislabel things or don't acquire the right records related to a person or an organization, then that can result in the only perspective that people have about history being incorrect. And so their sort of understanding of a person or of an event can be skewed in a way that wasn't correct. And sometimes that can have really, really negative consequences for society, and may lead people to think, oh, well, the only people that were important in history are rich white people because that's all I see in archives, when obviously that's not true. And if you look at some of the products that are developed as a result of archives, these can have a strong role in influencing what people think of, the Civil War or, really any historical event. Books can be extremely influential in how people think of historical events. Documentaries, movies, everything. All the products of media that are the result of the use of archival records really form a strong basis of our culture and how we might view different parts of history. And if these products are based on archival records, archival fragments that have been skewed in a particular way because of the choices that archivists made, or because archivists chose not to intervene with records when maybe they could or should have, then that can be really problematic. And again, it can have negative repercussions for society. So, this isn't sort of a trifling discussion to have, because archives really can shape social memory and how society sort of remembers an event and how society views itself. Another aspect of archiving that I want to touch on is archives are unstable. So records change over time, just physically, they age, they decay. Collections change over time as they're processed, as archivists work with them more. Collections may be added and removed to holdings, or records may be added and removed to the collections themselves. The understanding of collections changes over time as society changes, and they are used by researchers and reactivated. So, people in history are always being sort of reevaluated and sort of interpreted in different ways. And that can result in their records being viewed differently and looked at differently as well. And that's going to shape the understanding of the records that are in archival care. And additionally, the archival profession has evolved over time, which has resulted in changes in how archives operate. So I talked about the shift in archives towards wanting to promote more diversity and perspectives in archives. That's been a big shift in the profession. As the nature of records has changed, that has resulted in a big shift in how archives operate. So the rise of digital records that archives have had to contend with has really spurred the profession. And so, these developments and other developments have really pushed the archival profession in a particular way. So the profession as a whole is developing, and as a result of that, the archives that are run by archivists are changing and evolving as well. And another important thing to understand about archives, and the thing that I find the most interesting and engaging part of archives, is archives are multidisciplinary. So you might think of archives as just being a historical field, or might be just people working, in a dusty basement with records. But that's not true at all. The archival profession and archival work straddles issues like marketing. So archives have to market themselves. They have to know how to promote themselves to get the resources that they need to stay open. Technology. Archives, especially today, have to know how to use technology to preserve digital records and increasingly analog records, which are reaching the end of their kind of natural lifespan. That's a huge part of archives these days, is being sort of computer savvy and technologically savvy, and using that in archival work. Education is a big part of archives. So teaching people how to use collections, helping them use collections, being able to go in front of a classroom of 20 undergrads and teach them how to use archival records, can be a pretty daunting task, but it's something that more and more archives are asked to do these days. Archives are increasingly involved in social justice efforts, so helping people who have been marginalized in the past use archival records to right wrongs that they may have occurred, or to reacquire power that may have been taken from them in the past. That's something that archives are more and more engaged with and involved with. Ethical and legal issues are certainly present in archives and in archival processes, really at every single step. And we'll talk about that as we progress through the semester. So, archives are not just boring sort of static places. They are constantly evolving. The archival profession is constantly evolving, and archives, are really asked to do a lot of things related to a lot of different fields. And that's why, after being an archivist for 8 years and then teaching about archives for, I guess, another 8 or 9 years now, like, I'm still fascinated by archives. I'm fascinated by what archivists do, and the different processes that archives engage in, because it is so varied and it is so kind of endlessly evolving and interesting. And I hope that you feel the same way when we end the semester. So just to revisit our definitions, as I mentioned, we would, I think in this first definition, we can cross out the organically, because oftentimes this selection of records is not created organically at all, but rather it is created with a certain bias or desire in mind, and that sort of shapes what an archive ends up looking like. And for the second part of this definition here, archival records are not passive products. As we've talked about in this lecture, as the Douglas article talks about, as the Gold article talks about, as the Sheffield article talks about, as the Somers article talks about, there's nothing passive about it. It is a very active process that shapes archival records and shapes how archival records are used and understood. And there's nothing passive about it. Maybe there might be some stages of the process that are more passive than others, but it's kind of a constantly active process. Even if it takes place over 10 or 15 or 20 years, there still is all kinds of shaping and active engagement that goes on with archival records. So I like to cross out the passive here and just say archival records are products of human or administrative activity. So, okay, that was kind of a whirlwind overview of archives. I hope it was interesting. Again, we'll be revisiting a lot of these topics and issues during the rest of the semester. I really hope you enjoy this class. We do touch on a lot of interesting topics and issues, and we read a lot of articles, which I think are very interesting. And I hope you enjoy the ride, and I'm looking forward to teaching you this semester. So have a good one. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you soon.